evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, I'm delighted to introduce my guest today in the studio. I have Nalini Elumalai, who is a Senior Malaysia Programme Officer at Article 19, which is an NGO dedicated to advocacy of the freedom of expression, and Wathshlah Naidu, who is the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Journalism. They're both here today to discuss the recently released 2024 report on the state of freedom of expression in Malaysia. Welcome both of you to the show. It's good of you to join me here. I'm glad that we're having this conversation in person. Essentially a look at the report card of the year, or a reality check of the year. I do want to ask you though, before we look at the Malaysian situation, if we could zoom out and look at the state of freedom of expression globally and how that might impact the situation in Malaysia. Wathshlah, may I get you to answer that question? When you look at the global context for freedom of expression, what are you observing?
Thank you very much, Melisa. I think it's been really interesting. What we are seeing is that nothing much has changed vis-a-vis freedom of expression, right? Where the limitations around transparency, disclosure is still ongoing, all right? Where there are attacks against media, journalists, it's still happening, all right? I think what we are seeing that has changed is that everything that we used to experience offline, the killing of journalists, arrest of people, the crackdown against human rights defenders, is now moving also into online spaces. Right? This then has changed how we are looking at freedom of expression, because now the actors have multiplied. It's no longer just looking at the state as the threat to freedom of expression. Now you have businesses, you have other actors, including the netizens, you know, who are on these online spaces. But most importantly, I think because the medium has changed, there are other actors who are now also accountable. So this is where technology comes in play, right? And which has a huge impact on freedom of expression, because we have algorithms now, you know, deciding what we can and should be looking at, especially on social media. We have AI, which has changed how people use, you know, different technologies in terms of even deepfake, for example.
Yes.
So now there is a need also to interrogate not just the role of the state, but the role of technology and platform, right? Online service providers, content providers, what is then their responsibility and accountability. So when those things are changing, obviously that's then replicated also at national levels and various other countries. So
well, thank you. That's a great context to begin with, because we need to see what's happening globally and in contemporary times, because we're talking about that slightly different from maybe you know, a decade ago. Nalini, talk to me about, if we were to zoom in closer, from globally to regionally, are there any trends within ASEAN that you're paying attention to?
Yeah, definitely. I think like what Wathshlah was saying, there's a global trend, like every governments and states are talking about how to deal with some of the cybersecurity issues, fake news, for example, misinformation, disinformation, cyberbullying, and so on and so forth. We want to say it is a legitimate concern. We all have the same concern, but the questions remain, like how you want to hold these perpetrators accountable, the way you are doing it, right? So now coming into the region, every countries in the region, the ASEAN, for example, we all have a different history, we all have a different context, we all have different social movements and human rights struggles as well. But then what's happening now in the region, we also can see that the culture of impunity is also increasing, because this using these digital repressions and one way to censorship freedom of expression. Right. Almost all the governments are moving towards punitive measures in terms of tackling these legitimate concerns, right? For example, in Indonesia, they have the Electronic Information Transactions Law, it's called a ITE law, and this actually being used now against human rights defenders. It's some of the provisions on defamations and hate speech being used against human rights defenders. We have some laws in Thailand, for example, like Computer Crimes Act, you know, used against to suppress freedom of expression, and of course well-known 112 of the Criminal Code of Thailand on lèse majesté rule. So it also being used mostly against human rights defenders. So the region is actually also leading towards a very punitive measures, and Malaysia is catching up on that as well.
Thank you for putting that into context. When we look at Malaysia, so you've put out this report looking at, say, just the past year, and it's an interesting year to look at because it's the second year of the Madani government. I think a lot of people gave the Madani government a free pass in the first year to get their bearings, but in the second year, maybe the expectations are higher. So talk to me about the report. What was your assessment of the freedom of expression in Malaysia that you put in this report? What was most significant to you, Wathshlah?
Thank you. So this report is actually an annual report that we produce. And what we are seeing now is that, again, it goes back to nothing major has changed. And I wouldn't even go as far as to say things are drastically different, right? It's just that, as I said earlier, the actors may have evolved and the expectations have evolved, but I think the use of repressive laws that what Nalini mentioned is very critical. It's the same set of laws that we've been monitoring from last year to this year, right? And actually what is very interesting is that last year we noted a slightly higher number of times these laws were used, 193, whereas this year is 187, yeah? But I think what is interesting is the narrative out there vis-a-vis freedom of expression. So, of course, we keep hearing this thing, that freedom of expression is not absolute, and we agree, right? But what doesn't continue after that statement is the phrase that any restriction must be vis-a-vis what's in our federal constitution, Article 10, as well as what are the international standards. You know, there has to be a three-part test in terms of looking at the legality, looking at the necessity and the proportionality. And I think this is where our biggest challenge lies. And we look at the report, we have focused, of course, we've got this bit about, I don't want to call it a report card because Berse has done a report card and we, we are in no position to do another report card. But what it demonstrates by giving the data and the number is that promises were made, pledges were made, including through the Pakatan Harapan manifesto. And what we are seeing now is not just that things have not moved, but there's actual breaking of promises and pledges.
Can you give me specific examples?
For example,
of that?
one of the main things that was put forth in the 2022 manifesto, for example, is the promise to review, amend and repeal repressive and draconian legislations.
So
right?
that you're referring to the manifesto of
Pakatan Harapan
of in GE 15
in 2022. And these laws include Sedition Act, and we've seen a backtracking of this where they've said we need the Sedition Act. It included Printing Presses and Publications Act, and we see a backtracking of that where, obviously there were attempts to amend it and increase the powers of PPPA. And we are seeing the impact of the Communications and Multimedia Act, which has been so highly criticized in the past. Of course, most of our criticism in the past were focused on two specific provisions, Section 211 and Section 233. Now, our call will be really different because we were just joking, actually we were very serious. And it's also in our report that it's no longer just a call to repeal these two provisions. It's now a call to repeal the entire act because the amendments have actually contributed to a scenario where our freedom of expression is actually a threat.
Wow. Nalini, do you have anything to add to that? When you look at this report, what is most significant to you in terms of the state or the progress or the lack of that you're seeing this year?
I think I've been keep talking about this and also in all our MPs meetings as well, like the trust that you want to build in this country. For example, in the CMA amendments, you're giving a single institution a lot of power to go and look for data, to request for data without any judicial oversight. And again, we're coming back to the trust of the institution. We have a lot of history in the country where people don't trust some of the institutions because it's just so much happened in the past that people don't trust anymore. Again, now you're giving a lot of power to MCMC. Again, the question is like, if you want to build the trust of the people, you need to make sure that your institutions are really free, independent, and they need to have check and balances, but you're actually going around and then turning that to like more repressive. So what kind of message you're sending to the people in terms of your own accountability and your own call to trust the government?
I want to ask both of you some of the comments or the counter arguments that I hear whenever I talk about Freedom of Expression Malaysia or even the CMA amendments, right? Whenever I say, listen, we're concerned about the shrinking civil liberty space, the really repressive laws that are being put through, they say, well, you know, if you compare Malaysia in the long term, that we are so much better than we were before, that incremental progress should still be seen as progress, that it should still be celebrated and acknowledged, and that in fact going in the right direction is better than falling short of expectations. So they say the perfection is the enemy of good. So how do we think that through? How do you respond when you hear this argument? I'm sure you've heard it before.
Yeah, and I would completely agree to a large extent of what is being said, right? I think we don't expect immediate change. We don't expect immediate reform, although, you know, we've waited 20 odd years for the reform, right? What we expect is actual attempt for progressively realizing this change. Right, and we are not, and what we are seeing, however, is a backtracking, and I think that is a huge concern that we need to really address and challenge the current government, because yes, we understand you're going to need time, but give us a timeline. Show us where the progress is, right? And I always, it's really, and this is you know, it's not a matter, you know, to joke about, but what we are seeing, this is the one country where they call people for consultation, and whatever draft or parameters they share doesn't necessarily improve, but it gets worse. Right?
Oh.
I'll give you an example.
Post-consultation.
Post-consultation. I'll give you an example, right? So, for example, it took UK to come up with their online, you know, their legislation on online safety a number of years. You know, before it's adopted. Canada had to delay its second reading. Now it's been like, I think almost like a year. I think it's almost going to be a year for further consultation so that they can continue to improve it. And you see the improvement, right? Whereas here we get called in for, either we don't get called in at all for any consultation.
You mean for civil society?
Civil society or general stakeholders as well, right? Or we get called in, we are shown certain parameters which we may be critical, but at least it's more promising than what's finally tabled, right? And it's a pattern that we are seeing, right? So back to that whole question about, you know, your statement and how we should approach this is that we recognize the challenges the states go through, right? Challenges could be as simple as resources, right? Both financial, human resources to get it through. You need more time. We absolutely will respect that. Show us some progress in terms of the timeline or the plan, your action plan, right? And not to keep backtracking. You can't say you're going to table this bill, you know, for example, the Media Council bill that kept getting pushed back. Luckily, you know, it was tabled for first reading. The freedom of information legislation that got pushed back, and now it's pushed back to the second session of Parliament next year. So I think this constant backtracking is problematic.
It's like Nalini said, the erosion of trust, right? Can I ask you, Wathshlah, when you said that sometimes the after consultation, the draft gets worse, so there's actually a decline in terms of how good the draft is. What do you think is behind that? Why do you think that happens?
Perhaps also who else they are consulting, right? I think to start off, I will give credit to the Minister of Law, Dato Sri Azalina's team, in terms of how they wanted to consult with different people. They did set up an expert council. Bayu, the Legal Affairs Division, attempted to engage with many other people, right? So they did bring in civil society. Article 19 was in, CIJ was in it, so were representatives from Bersih and the CSO platform as the council member. Then they brought in the academics. So there was this one general consultation, right? But then they go back, the other consultations that happen, I guess, at the ministerial level, at the cabinet level. So then discussions, decisions are being made, which may not necessarily reflect the kind of feedback that we give. So we gave written feedback, Article 19, CIJ gave written feedback. We also submitted joint memorandums from a larger coalition of organizations, FOE organizations, child rights and women's rights. But if you look at the kind of feedback we had given and the outcome or the final bill that was tabled and passed, you will see the vast difference.
Wow, that's incredible. Nalini, when you come across people who say, like, let's celebrate progress in the right direction, and that Malaysia is at least, freedom of expression. There's more today than there were, years ago. So how do you respond to that?
I think I always say that, okay, we recognize that some of the contributions and some of the progress they are making, but also, like, as an activist, I have a role to play. I have to tell the truth. I can't be insincere to people who are asking me about what is the progress, right? So while giving credits to whatever that the government is doing good, we also have to critical of what they're not doing good. But my only problem with this whole thing is, like, one is political will, but also sincerity, right? The sincerity, the real change will come when you are sincere to make the change, right? That is lacking. That's what I'm not seeing, right? Probably that we have really good government servants who really, like, want to do some differences, but at the end it will stop when it go to the top level. So I think, that's where
you have to stay true to your advocacy and to your cause. When we talked about the CMA amendments and the concerns that you and other civil society groups have with how repressive this law is, now you're calling for an entire repeal of the law. Talk to me about that. What other options are on the table for us beyond having laws like the CMA and the amendments? Because a lot of people will say, well, this is good because we know it's about protecting our children online. It's about protecting ourselves from scams and cybersecurity and the like. Are there alternative approaches that we ought to be considering?
I think I'll just start. Maybe you can add on. So one of the things that we've been proposing to all the government dialogues and everything, like, address the root causes of these problems.
What is the root cause?
So, like, cyberbullying, it is something to do with, like, gender issues, gender imbalance, power imbalance in society, discrimination, and also so many other issues related to, when we talk about hate speech, for example, the issues are different, right? So these are the root causes, these are the root problem, and this exists even before social media companies exist, right? So the problem has not been resolved. We never find a solution for all this discrimination that we have in this country. We have to start talking about that. So what I'm seeing now is, like, as though this problem only happened when the social media come into picture. Meanwhile, it's already been there for years and years. So you can't wash your hands and say that I'm giving you all the responsibility. You take the responsibility, make sure that there's no more discrimination, there's no more cyberbullying. It won't work like that, because we've been working with these issues for so many years. We know that if you don't find the root problem and the root causes and the solution for that, you can't change anything, because behavior changes is what we needed now. The mindset has to change. If you don't change that, people will create even more 100 pages just to do the same thing, but your behavior doesn't change, because we are not working on that.
No amount of legislation will change behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the other thing, especially when we talk about platform accountability, the focus on CMA as well as the online safety bill, to a large extent, is about content, right? The content per se is exactly what Nalini said, right? You address the content on the basis of root causes, right? But we do, however, want to hold platforms accountable, but not by asking them to, disclose data and give us information about the content, data of the users and so on. But what we want them to do is correct their systems and processes, right? It is their algorithms and their AI that they use to, to create echo chambers, right? It is the same AI that they use in terms of content moderation, for example, and it is the same systems that they have around advertising that encourages more and more of these content. And it's also the same thing, the opportunities around monetization of your content is what is creating some of the challenges. So we need to go back to the platforms to require three things, right? One thing is put in place clear safety measures. And we need to, our submissions have clearly listed them out. What are these safety measures that we are looking at, right? The users' access to, say, block certain content, block certain users, right? Users' access to certain tools that will allow us to put in place some of these safety measures. The second thing, and this it involves more mainly children too, in terms of user empowerment. You have the safety measures in place, you have the tools in place. Do we then know how to use them? Do parents know how to use them? And we're not talking about going into digital verification of age or users and so on. You put in place the measures because you know how your algorithm works, right? And the most important thing is transparency of how you're using your algorithm. We don't want access to your coding and things like that. We just need to know the number of times, you know, when who are the people who are availing themselves to the advertising opportunities, right? Transparency is absolutely critical. You need to get to, you know, Article 19 has this in their report as well. Look at it from the business perspective. They are getting, you know, they are profiting from their platforms, right? So how do we make sure you correct the system, not undermine our freedom of expression? And that's why we keep telling the government, right?
So this is interesting. Is that what you're seeing the government ask for, push for from the platforms?
Unfortunately. So when we were having discussions about online safety bill, that was the impression was given to us. We want to deal with the systemic issues of the platform and so on and so forth, whatever that Wathshlah was saying. But when we had the bill and also parameters before that, it looks like it's more like moderating the content instead of addressing the issues that we were talking about. So we were saying, this is your opportunity to put the platforms accountable, use it properly, but somehow it ended up like content moderation as well. So that is the problem that we are talking about. So platforms, now you're giving more power to them to kind of filter any contents online, because it looks like from the CMA amendment, it looks like every content is illegal. So without a proper definitions and with the broad terms and everything, platforms now with the social media licensing, so now you have to see that if they don't remove the contents or filter the content, they are liable, liable criminally. And that also giving them a lot of power to do pre-censorship, anything before public see it. So while you are talking about putting the platform accountable, you're actually giving them more power to decide what to be on the platform, what we shouldn't see as well.
These are the unintended consequences of what's happened. Well, thank you both for laying this out for us. You know, it's actually really enlightening. But I do want to ask you, in the time that we have left, very quickly, maybe each of you can share with me what you would like, your final message in terms of what you would like this government to do in 2025, so that we can come back at the end of the year next year and say that actually there's been progress, that there's not been as much backtracking that we've seen this year. Wathshlah, may I ask you?
I think two things. One is, I think they really need to check themselves with regards to how they focus more on political expediency. And these laws are a composite in being able to not just address the scenario that they have created, the pornography scam and child sexual abuse material, but really it's an attempt to silence voices, critical voices, right? And I think we need the public to hold the government to account. That's one thing. The second thing, very briefly, it's all is not doom and gloom even in our report. We want to acknowledge the work that is being done by the Legal Affairs Division, by you, Bahagian Hal Ehwal Undang-Undang, in pushing for the, we call it the right to information legislation, and of course the government calls it the freedom of information legislation. It's critical because they've been very consultative. They've been consulting civil society. They have created many opportunities for us to give feedback. And this is a 5-year relationship we are talking about. It's not something that's being rushed through, although there's delays, but I appreciate the amount of, or the level of commitment that Bayu has with regards to this, right? But we hope that, as what Nalini said, at the higher it goes, I hope then they don't face the challenges. So we are looking forward to a very, very progressive right to information legislation that is focused on transparency and not get held back by this culture of secrecy we have under the Official Secrets Act.
Fantastic. Nalini, your final message.
I just think think that Malaysia has a really good opportunities to make progress because we have a very vibrant civil society, a vibrant communities and society as well. So I think it depends, you know, if the government where they want to stand and take which part. If they want to take a part to engage more with the civil society, listen to our solutions and listen to us, and then we will progress much better. But if you're on the other side, then we'll be creating a society that will be ignorant when we limit information. We will create a society where disengage with public participation, and you're creating a society who never question anything. At the end, we'll create an environment where there's a more power to those in power, and the people on the ground, and you're not talking about it, you're not hold them accountable. That means we're going to suffer more with the very repressive environment instead of like progressive environment. So I think the questions and challenges back to the government where you stand instead of to us. We know where we stand on this, you know, it's just to the government. Yeah.
Thank you both. I appreciate your time so much. Thank you for sharing your insights and your good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.